con otra mirada, la experiencia creativa
de Ellen Wiener. Fuerte aplauso para ella.
Can you hear me? It's okay. I'm speaking in English, and I understand there is simultaneous translation, so I hope everybody can hear and understand. Today, I'm going to talk to you about what I call studio habits of mind, which I believe are the real benefits of visual arts education. Am I too loud? Okay. So, my question is, why should we teach the arts in our schools? And this is a controversial question in the United States. And I want to talk about two things: flawed claims, bad research, number one, and number two, a better research agenda. So first, the bad claims. So please raise your hands if you have heard the claim in Spain that arts education is good because it raises test scores. Have you heard this claim? Not very many, only or some. In the United States, this is very common. This is a sign outside of a music store selling guitars. Playing music makes you smarter. How many people have heard that kind of a claim? Not very many, some. In the United States, it's everywhere. These are two pictures for an advertisement for a group that advocates for the arts in the United States. It's called Americans for the Arts. And on the left, you see a picture of yogurt, but it's called Van Gogurt. Get it? And at the bottom, it says, raises test scores. And over here, we have Elizabeth Barrett Brownings, after the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And at the bottom, fortified with improved math and reading skills. There was a poll done in the United States 10 years ago. Do you believe that learning a musical instrument improves math and science skills? How many people believe that? Raise your hand if you believe that. Raise your hand if you do not believe that. Okay. In the United States, the number of people who said yes was 80%. But there is absolutely no evidence in favor of this. It just feels right to people. But nobody has demonstrated that this is true. And yet we believe it. Could you raise your hands if you have heard of the Mozart effect? Okay. Most of you have not. So I'm going to tell you about the Mozart effect and tell you what's wrong with it. This is a legitimate scientific finding. It can be replicated, but it has absolutely no educational application, and I'll show you why. And it's been completely distorted by the popular media and by commercial interests. So here's the Mozart effect experiment. You take a room like this, and you divide people up randomly into 3 groups, group 1, group 2, and group 3. And you put them in separate rooms. Group 1 listens to 10 minutes of Mozart. Group 2 listens to 10 minutes of a relaxation instructions. Relax, take a deep breath, etc. And group 3, 10 minutes of nothing. So, this is what, if you were in the Mozart group, you would hear this. 10 minutes. It might put you into a good mood, remember that. After that, you're given spatial tests with a piece of paper and a pencil. And there's a right answer. I'm going to show you one of them. This is called the paper folding test, and it's very difficult. Imagine that this is a piece of paper. The dotted line is where you fold it, and the arrows show you the direction of folding. So move in your mind from the left to the right. When you get here, M stands for mirror. Flip it to its mirror image. Turn it 180 degrees. Take a scissors and snip it, and you end up with that shape. Now mentally unfold it and tell me, which of these shapes do you get? Very difficult. Does anybody want to try? Yes? Did you say D? It's B. I can prove it to you with a piece of paper. And you are very visual spatial. This is an extremely difficult test. There were 2 others that were easier, but they all involve having an image in your mind that you move around. Okay, so the surprising results were that the music group did better on the spatial tests than the relaxation group and the silence group. This was statistically significant. After listening to Mozart, you do better on spatial tests. That's what the results said. The effect lasts only 10 to 15 minutes, because if I test you 20 minutes later, it's gone. There's no difference across the groups. So that's why it has no educational implication. But people didn't realize that. So there became a frenzy in the media. And you saw things like this. Can playing the piano get you into Harvard? Or babies who are listening to Mozart because it will make them smarter. Now, a very skeptical psychologist from Canada named Glenn Schellenberg didn't like this. He studies music, and he saw no reason why listening to music should make you do better on these kinds of visual spatial tests. It didn't make sense psychologically. So he did a study where he asked people either to listen to Mozart or to listen to a short story by Stephen King. Have you heard of Stephen King? Okay. He writes thriller novels. And afterwards, people took the same test. But then he asked people, if you were asked to listen to Mozart, would you prefer that, or would you have preferred to listen to Stephen King? And the same for the Stephen King listeners. And the finding was that if you preferred Mozart, you did better on the spatial test. If you preferred Stephen King and you listened to Stephen King, you did better on the spatial test. So, just to be clear, if you listened to something you liked, whether it was Mozart or Stephen King, you did better on the spatial test. Conclusion, you do better on tests when you're in a good and aroused mood, alert and feeling positive. Nothing to do with Mozart. So that was bad for the Mozart effect. So these kinds of false claims that music makes you smarter, music makes you better on tests, arts make you smarter, these come because arts educators in the United States are desperate to get a place for the arts in school. Because schools see the arts as a frill, an extra, as something that involves only feeling but not thinking. and is something that involves only doing but not thinking. And they are always the first to be cut from the budget. Oh, get rid of the arts, that's just an extra. So all of which goes to show that we don't believe that the arts are really important. They're not basic. They're not core skills. Now, in reaction to this, arts advocates in the United States fight back. And they fight back, unfortunately, with false claims. They say the arts are the royal road to academic success. If you really want children to do well, give them the arts. Not because of the arts, but because it will make them better in math and verbal skills. One of the reasons that these false claims persist is that they are based on correlational data. Correlational data has been wrongly interpreted as demonstrating some kind of cause. So let me demonstrate. Let me show you. Every year, there's a publication by an organization called the College Board, which writes the exams, the multiple choice exams that all students have to take if they want to go to university. They're math and they're verbal. And the music educators of the United States pulled out from that data the relationship between taking a lot of music classes in high school and the scores on these tests. So the scores go up to 800. So if you've taken no music, actually, they've done this for music and they've done it for all the arts, so I'm just going to talk about the arts. If you've taken no arts, your score is only about 425. Not very good. 1 year, look at that. If you've taken 2 years of arts in high school, they're 4 years of high school. If you've taken 2 years of arts, your score's even higher. 3 years, even more. 4 years, even higher. Over 4 years, doesn't matter. And since they're only 4 years of high school, so actually I don't even understand how that got there. So the interpretation has been, look, if you take the arts, it causes your scores to go up. But of course, this is purely correlational. There are many explanations that have nothing to do with causality. Students could be attending schools that are strong in both the arts and academics. So they would take a lot of arts and also do well on their tests because they have strong teachers in the academic subjects. They may come from families that value both arts and academics. They may be doing so well academically that they have time to take more arts classes. Or they may have more energy, more motivation, and they may have the motivation to master both academics and the arts. And this is a kind of Machiavellian explanation, but in the United States, it's so difficult to get into the top universities that it's not enough to have top scores. You need to have all kinds of extras, like I play the violin, or I sculpt. So they may be taking arts classes to build their resumes so that they can get into the Harvards and the Princetons and the Stanfords. Now, in England, in the UK, a similar study was done by somebody named John Harland. Christopher, maybe you know about this. I hope I don't get it wrong. But they found that the more arts courses taken in high school in England, the worse, the poorer the performance on the national exams at the end of secondary school. So how could this be? In the United States, the more arts you take, the better you do on exams. In England, the more arts you take, the worse you do on exams. Well, it really can be explained by the kind of students who study the arts. So in the United States, if you're a poor student, you don't get told, go into the arts track. You get told, you need to take more math, more verbal skills. You need to stay after and do more academics. But in the UK, the students who are told to, and this may have changed by now, but when the study was done, the students who are told to concentrate in the arts are the weaker academic students. Don't take an academic track, take an arts track. And so what this just tells us is there's a cultural difference in the values, in the beliefs about who should study the arts. Should weak students study the arts because they shouldn't study academics? Well, if that happens, then you're going to get the UK result. In either case, nothing has been demonstrated about the arts causing test scores to change. So, about 15 years ago, a colleague of mine named Lois Hetland and I decided to find all the studies we could find that had looked at whether or not the arts cause test scores or grades to rise. We weren't interested in the correlational evidence. We wanted the studies that took kids and tested them before the arts, and then gave one group the arts and one group something else, and then looked a few years later to see whether the group that got the arts started improving more. That's the only way, doing an experiment, that we could prove that the arts are actually causing academic changes. So we reviewed many, many, many studies, and we combined them into great big statistical syntheses. And we found that most of the claims did not hold up. We published 10 papers, and 7 out of 10 said there is no causal relationship. The one that I will stress now is the one that said students that are getting lots of different kinds of arts in school do not grow more strongly academically than the students who are not getting a lot of arts. And we published this. And we said, look, arts education does not raise test scores, does not raise grades. That's not why we should have arts in our school. Stop saying this. It's not true. So I got a phone call from a major United States funding agency for arts education, and I picked up the phone, and he told me who he was, and I thought, wow, he's calling me? And he said, I just want to tell you that you are going to single-handedly ruin quality arts education for the students in this country because of your publication. Because as soon as schools find out that arts do not raise test scores, they'll say, get rid of the arts. Who needs them? I was talking about my findings to a very distinguished historian from Princeton. And he said to me, you should not have done this research. But since you did it, you should have buried your findings. You should not have published them. So we were pretty upset because we did not want to be vilified by the arts community. So we thought, how can we do this research better to show what the arts really do, if not raise test scores? How can we make a positive contribution to this conversation? So we thought about the research that we had reviewed, and we realized there were 2 flaws in the research. First of all, in the research, there was never any measure of what was being taught in arts class. The studies just said, kids got the arts, and here's how they did on their tests. But what were they getting in the arts? What was being taught? There was no measure of learning. There was no measure of whether kids were actually learning anything. And finally, there was no theory about what is it about learning in the arts that should transfer over to other areas of the school curriculum. There has to be a theory. You can't just say, oh, I think the arts raise test scores. Let's see if they do. Why? What would the explanation be? What is it about learning in the arts that would make test scores go up? So we tried to come up with a more positive research agenda. And here's what we did. We've published a book based on our findings, called the title of this talk, Studio Thinking, The Real Benefits of Visual Arts Education. And then we published a second edition called Studio Thinking 2. And we asked, what is actually being taught in arts classes? We decided to start with the visual arts, because you can't do everything at once. And we decided to start with high schools with very broad, with very strong arts programs. And what we were looking for was what kind of habits of mind are being taught in visual arts classes. And by habits of mind, I mean big, broad habits that are potentially things that you could use outside of the art studio and would be presumably useful in life. So if you're an art teacher, could just think to yourself, what kind of habits of mind do my students learn if I'm teaching them well? There's really a 3-part program of research that we are undertaking. And our book reports only on the first part. But now we're looking at part 2 and part 3. So the first part is, what's being taught? What habits of mind are being taught in the art studio? It's a bottom-up approach. We're studying in the studio, observing and watching. Second, are these habits of mind actually mastered? Are they learned? And 3, do they generalize beyond the art room? So here's what we did. We went to 2 schools where students could concentrate in the arts. Arts schools, they're regular high schools, but they're especially for students that want to study the arts. And they can spend a lot of time, a minimum of 10 hours a week, instruction in the arts. And the teachers are practicing artists. So very different from typical schools, because we wanted to start at the very top with the best possible arts education to see what was being taught. And these students could major in visual arts, but they could also major in theater, or dance, or music, or creative writing. So we studied the visual arts students, and we compared them to the theater students. We videotaped classes once a month, 3-hour classes for each teacher. So we ended up with 38 videotapes of 3 hours long. After each class that we videotaped, we interviewed the teacher saying, what were you doing? What were you doing here? We showed them the videotape. What were you doing here? Why were you doing it? What were you trying to teach? Why did you do it that way? And then we spent 1 year arguing, the researchers, arguing about how to code the interviews and the videotapes for what habits of mind were being taught. And we ended up making the case for 4 cognitive skills that were being taught that we think are potentially generalizable. So I'm going to play this little video, just very short, and the words up there are what is being said by the teacher, and see if you can think about what you think is being taught here.
As you look through the viewfinder, look at all 4 sides. Don't just think of the top and then the bottom. You know, like we tend to look at the earth, we think of the sky and the ground. Look at the viewfinder and think of look at all 4 sides of the hole in the cardboard.
Now, I would ask people what they think is being taught, but I don't know if I'll understand your Spanish. So if you think you understand what's being taught, a viewfinder, by the way, is a cardboard frame, and you take it and you look through it to cut off a scene, to frame a scene. Does anybody think they know what is being taught? Just raise your hand. No? Yes? Say it again. Ovismo? Does it? What? Curious? Okay. No? Cubism. Oh. Well, that's not how we coded it. Yeah. Could have coded it that way too. Space. Well, here's how we coded it. We coded it as looking, observing, learning to look really closely, because he said, look at all four sides. I can understand how this would lead to composition. And what did you say again? Cubism. Okay. Yes, you could turn it into a cubist composition, but we coded this for learning to observe. And really what we mean by that is learning to look at things more closely than ordinarily, because ordinarily we walk through life and don't see. So learning to really look and see things that you might not otherwise see. That's a habit of mind that we saw being taught. Here's an example of something that we coded as observe. Forget that you're looking at somebody's arm or a table. Just think about the shapes, the colors, the lines, and the textures as you're looking through the viewfinder. Observation is difficult because we see what we expect to see. So that's why people often draw hands if they're drawing a person. They draw hands too small or eyes too high up, or we draw things that are far away too big. And if you're really doing careful observational drawing, it forces you to break away from the stereotypes. It forces you to break away from what you think, what you expect, and to really look at what you see, to really notice what you see. And of course, observation is extremely important, not just in the arts, but in the sciences. Now here's another one, and the videotape is corrupt. The movie is corrupt, so I'm just going to read it to you. I'm going to explain it. This is a ceramics teacher, and he was teaching the students to take one shape, in this case, a leaf-like shape here. And he said, build up your unit with this one shape until it goes all the way up to here. That's what he did with his hands. And the student went, oh. And we coded that as envision. There was nothing to see. She had to generate the mental image of what he was talking about. She had to visualize it. And he says, this might be your unit. What happens if you start alternating and building a whole sculpture of this sort, as he moved his hands up? So envision is learning to picture mentally what you can't see directly and learning to imagine possibilities in your work. Here's some comments. Here's some questions by teachers that we coded as challenging students to envision. How much white space will you be leaving in your self-portrait? They have to envision that. It's not there. How many other kinds of orange can you imagine? What would that look like if you darkened this area? Can you see the underlying triangle that connects these figures? And of course, envisioning is not just important in the visual arts. Here's the structure of DNA, the double helix. That had to be envisioned. It wasn't there to be seen. The third cognitive skill is what we called reflection. Because in every arts class, there was a critique session at the end where students had to evaluate their own work and others. And also during the class, the teacher walked around all the time and said, what are you doing here? Why are you doing it this way? And the student had to explain their process. They had to reflect on what they were doing and explain it. So this is very metacognitive. Explain your thinking processes and evaluate. Here are some questions that they asked which prompted this kind of metacognition. Is this working? Is this what I intended? Can I make this better? What next? These are the kinds of questions that the teachers would pose to the students, making them think about their process and evaluate their work. They were constantly being pushed to evaluate their work, to analyze their own process, to judge it, and to reconceptualize. What should I do next? The art educator Elliot Eisner called this learning to make judgments in the absence of rule, when you have to evaluate works of art, you're making judgments, but there's no rule that tells you exactly how to do it. We thought it was pretty surprising that in the art classes we studied, there was so much emphasis on thinking and perception in the art classes, because usually when people say, what goes on in art class, people say, oh, it's all about feeling, it's all about emotion. And it is about feeling and emotion, but it's also very much about thinking, decision-making, and reflection. Here's what Degas said about reflection. No art is less spontaneous than mine. What I do is the result of reflection and the study of the great masters. And then he said, a work of art requires as much premeditation as a great crime. Okay, so now here's the fourth skill that we coded. And the sound isn't right. So this is one of the art teachers, Jim, talking to this student about his drawing. And the student is drawing figures that are on the stage. So it's an observational drawing. And the teacher says, forget about the figures for now. Remember about the light in between, the drama, the stage. Like when you go to see a play and you see bright lights, a strange stage mood, like that, okay? So we coded that as express, learning to express, learning to create works that convey an idea, a feeling, a personal meaning, not just technically accurate. And this teacher said, art is beyond technique. And he also said, a drawing done honestly and directly always expresses feeling. So expression is very important, and it's something that was continually being taught. Don't just make a perfectly accurate drawing. Work on conveying a mood, a feeling. The arts educators that we've studied stress that the arts, all of the arts, are the only subject in school where students can express themselves. Okay, so that was 4 cognitive skills. Observe, envision, sorry? I can't hear you, but reflection, thank you very much. Observe, envision, reflection, and express. And then finally, 2 things that we called working styles. They're not cognitive skills, but they're ways of working. One is engage and persist. Get engaged in a problem and stick with it over time. Don't rush through it quickly, but really work at it. Learning to get engaged and inner-directed and to focus and to work through frustration. Don't give up. Here's what Degas said about that. One must do the same subject over again, 10 times, 100 times. In art, nothing must resemble an accident, not even movement. And of course, learning to persist is crucially important in other areas of school, and it's really important in all areas of life if you learn to stick with things. And the second working style was what we called stretch and explore. We could have called it creativity, but we didn't use that word because that word is so hard to define and everybody has their own definition of it. So instead we used the term to stretch beyond your ordinary boundaries and explore. And here's an example. Students walked into ceramics class and the teacher said, "Today, I want you to just play around and see what happens, and maybe you'll learn a new technique." Now, you would never hear this in math class, or only in the most innovative math class, because I can't imagine my math teacher ever saying, "Okay, today we're going to play around, and maybe you'll discover a new way to do division." It just doesn't happen. You're told this is what you do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, now do it. And stretch and explore leads to innovation. And obviously, stretch and explore is really important in all areas of the school curriculum, and it's pretty important in life to be able to think outside the box. I don't know if you have that expression, think outside the box. Do you have that? Think unconventionally. So one of the things we wondered is, should other areas of the curriculum model themselves on studio arts teaching? And we tried to argue that actually what goes on in the studio art room would be a very good model for the rest of school. For one thing, it's based on projects, long projects over time. And I call this with just-in-time intervention because the teacher walks around as each student is working and intervenes just at the right moment. Like, why are you doing this? Or, think about this. Or, wait a minute, do you think that really works? The projects that involve exploration, and at the end, there's critiques at the end of each class. You don't find that typically in other kinds of classes. You don't usually have kids posting their math work and having students go around and say, well, I think he did it this way, and this works, but this way doesn't work so well. That's typically reserved for the art room, but it would be very useful to use it in other areas of the curriculum. Okay, so that's just a brief summary of the first part of our research program, what's taught in the arts. I just wanted to say a little bit now about how we're looking at what's learned in the arts. Are these habits of mind that I've just described to you successfully mastered? And do they generalize beyond the art room? So we started looking at envision, because we have to do it one habit at a time. So we started saying, how can we measure envision? And how can we find out whether students who study visual arts in these very strong classrooms are getting better at manipulating mental images? So we asked ourselves, well, what area of the curriculum requires envisioning besides the visual arts? And we decided to look at geometry, because geometry involves visualization. And we decided to compare the visual arts majors to the theater majors at one of the schools we studied, and look at how they are in geometric reasoning. And we followed them over 2 years. At the beginning of when they were 14 years of old, when they were 15, and when they were 16. Here's an example of a geometry problem. You can test yourself. When two squares, like the ones shown below, are partially overlapped, different geometric shapes are formed by the overlapping parts. Which of the following figures cannot be formed by the overlapping parts of the two tiles? And they're given these 5 choices: triangle, rectangle, 5-sided, 8-sided, and 9-sided. You cannot draw to discover this. You have to do it in your head. But I have to draw to do it. So I drew it out and came up with the right answer, I believe, which is a 9-sided figure. But they were not allowed to draw. This is a kind of geometry question that does not involve any kind of knowledge of formulas. We weren't interested in that kind of geometry. We just wanted to look at the kind of spatial reasoning that's required in geometry. So here's what we found. We gave them a pre-test in the beginning of the 9th grade when they're 14. The blue are the visual artists, and the red are the theater majors. And you can already see that when they're entering 9th grade, who's better? The visual artists. The visual arts students who are choosing to study the visual arts are already better at this kind of geometric spatial reasoning. But then look what happens over 2 years. the theater group gets a little bit better, but it levels off, and the visual art group grows stronger. And so this was a demonstration that the study of the visual arts not only teaches students to envision, but they learn it. And it spills over into geometric reasoning. Now I have a very good student named Jill Hogan, and she wants to develop measures of all of the habits, not just envision. So she's developing a measure of observe, and she hasn't yet compared how students do on this measure who have had the arts versus who have not had the arts. She's just working on developing the measure. Now you might say, why are you measuring this stuff? Well, I'm measuring it because I'm an experimental psychologist, and I want to find out whether studying the visual arts really does teach you to see better. I can't just say it. I have to figure out a way of quantifying it. Some people hate the word quantify, but I think you can quantify in a smart way, as well as quantify in a dumb way. So I hope I'm doing it in a smart way. So Jill came up with this measure. This is for very young children. You show them these two pictures, and you say, circle all the differences between the two pictures. So if you look very closely at these two pictures, there are actually many differences. Just look for a minute. For example, the hat. Look at the hat. Let me show you how many differences there really are. Each one of those is a difference. You have to look, really carefully. So she's now developing this measure, and she's actually given it to 3,000 children all across the United States in different kinds of arts education classes, some strong, some weak. And she's trying to find out whether the ones in the strong classes, she's got ways of measuring that, are going to grow more and observe. She's just finished collecting the data. She actually emailed me this morning with a question about how to analyze the data, so I don't have the findings yet. And she also wanted to have another measure of envision besides geometric reasoning, one that she could use for young children. So see what you think of this measure. She says to children, we're going to now do some mental drawing. You cannot use a paper and pencil. So I'm going to ask you now to do mental drawing. I'm going to tell you something I'm going to describe something that's a letter of the alphabet, and your job is to figure out which letter I'm describing. Draw a circle in your mind. On the right side of the circle, draw an up and down line. It should go down past the circle and then curve to the left. Now pick up your pencil and draw the letter that you drew in your head. And that's what it was, a G. See? Draw a circle. On the right side of the circle, draw an up and down line. It should go past the circle and then curve to the left. That requires generating and manipulating mental imagery. Again, these 3,000 students got this measure too, but there were many of these questions, not just one. And sometimes they were pictures of objects, sometimes they were letters, sometimes they were numbers. She has also taken our studio thinking work and taken it to music classes. She went to high school music, high school orchestra classes, and high school band classes, and did the same thing we did, videotaped and interviewed, and then coded the habits of mind. And what she found was a lot of the top line, a lot of engage and persist, stick to things, keep going, a lot of evaluate. Is this good? Is this working? A lot of listen and a lot of imagine. Those are a little bit different from the ones we had. And very little stretch and explore, and very little reflection on process. Basically, the students were told, do it this way. not what are the many different ways you could play this. So very different from how the visual arts are taught in the United States. Much less individual innovation. So let me end, so we have time for questions, with a few concluding thoughts. I believe that habits of mind outcomes are far more important than test scores. And the habits of mind that I believe we have seen being taught, we haven't yet proven that they're all learned, but we have seen them being taught in high-level visual arts classes, are learning to observe or seeing accurately and directly, learning to envision or generate mental images, learning how to question what and how one is seeing, and learning how to reflect on what one is looking at, expressing, stretching beyond your comfort zone, which can lead to the experience of flow, feeling in the moment, losing sense of time and space, and really focusing, and experimenting and come up with new ideas. That's what I think Stretch and Explore does. Being willing to make mistakes. Because if you're stretching and exploring, you're going to make mistakes. And then remember the teacher who said just muck around, meaning just try things out, experiment, and maybe you'll come up with something interesting. But anybody that's told just experiment knows that it's okay to try things that don't work. Becoming engaged and knowing when to stop because you've lost focus, and learning how to regain focus, and learning how to stick to things, persist. And I think this is my final slide. You may wonder, why are you looking for transfer when you just finished, you started out by saying the arts do not raise test scores? Well, I don't believe that we should justify arts education by what they do for other things, because I believe the arts are just as important as the sciences in education, and I believe that profoundly, because I think education is about teaching children about the most important human inventions, and the arts and the sciences are equally important. In fact, the arts started long before the sciences. But the reason I study what the arts do for other areas, does it spill over into geometry, for instance, is because I think it's really intellectually interesting to understand the relationship between thinking in the arts and thinking out of the arts. What is the connection? I want to understand that. But from a practical point of view, I think it's helpful to provide educators with plausible benefits of visual arts education that is really backed up by evidence, as opposed to these false claims that studying the arts will make you do better on your multiple choice college entrance exams. And finally, because I think it would be great to convince people that the studio classroom should be a model for the teaching of other subjects. And so now we have time for questions. We have 12 minutes for questions. I've been told I have to end at 5:30, but I'll stay for as long as I'm allowed to if you have questions. That's it.
Sí, ahí estamos. Muy bien. Are you finished? Are you finished? Yes.
Well, yes, I'm waiting for
Okay.
questions.
Que el traductor, no sé por qué no me ha traducido. Bien, pues nada, ha sido un gusto para tenerte aquí en el Congreso, así que vamos a despedirla con un fuerte aplauso. Que no ha acabado, ¿qué?
Que no ha acabado.
Ah, vale, porque tenemos preguntas.
¿Hay preguntas?
Vale, pues venga, pues
Vale.
preguntas.
Sí, ahí arriba hay una.
¿Qué haríamos
parte
sin vosotros, eh? Ay. Venga, ¿qué preguntas tenemos por ahí?
Ahí
Aquí.
arriba tenemos una pregunta.
Sí. Espera un segundo. Bien. Que te damos el micrófono. La puedes hacer en el idioma que quieras, ¿vale? La podemos traducir. O sea, que
Sí,
lanza.
pero tú no la traducas.
I got the impression after listening to you that art education do not have rules or do not have a theory. I heard two of the speakers from yesterday saying just the opposite, and I do agree with them. Arts need a theory and need rules, otherwise will be a chaos. And saying Alberto Adella words, he said, chaos, order, chaos. So when you go to an art class, you don't have to see people only saying, okay, do that, observe. They need the theory and putting the theory in practice. And the other thing, I don't think we should consider academics and art separately. You mentioned it at the end. So it's not fair to do, for me, from my humble opinion, to do a study only of the arts. It's more important the influence of the arts in the academics and the academics in the art, as you already mentioned at the very end. So I don't think, from my point of view, that arts should be on top of academics or just the opposite. We need each other. The problem maybe in America, like here, was that arts were a bit forgotten. They are not magic, they are not better, but we need them.
Yes. Okay. So, yes, simple questions. I'm going to start with the second one. You're saying we shouldn't, I think you're saying we shouldn't study the arts separately from academics. They should go together. We call that arts integration. Teach history with the arts. Teach math with music. Teach geometry with visual arts. And some teachers do that. And I think that's great. But I also think that the arts are their own discipline and should be taught separately as well. Yes? That's not what you meant?
Not exactly. I think that the study shouldn't be done separately. You study only the influence of arts.
I see. Okay. Yes, okay. So why didn't I study whether math improves music? Instead, why are people looking at whether music improves math? Are you asking something like that?
More or less.
Okay.
My question is, where are we judging arts and not academics?
Yes, okay, exactly. So nobody asks us to justify academics. Nobody questions the importance of studying foreign languages or the importance of studying math or the importance of studying reading. People just question the importance of studying the arts. And that's why all this research has been done to say, look, you think it's not important? We're going to show you that it's really important because it helps those other things that you don't question, the academics. But of course, we could also do the study the other way around. We could study the effect of science teaching or the effect of geometry on drawing. Nobody does that, and I agree with you that would be just as interesting, but the reason we don't do it is because it's the arts that need to be justified in our culture.
Thank you. And the last thing, you were judging the results looking through the national test. Shouldn't we do a studio about the national test?
Should we have a national test for studio thinking?
Yeah.
So I really worry about that because I'm afraid the test will get dumbed down. Can somebody translate dumbed? The tests will be made stupid. So in principle, yes, I think it would be wonderful. But I worry, first of all, it's never going to happen in the United States. And I worry that if people develop tests, they would be multiple choice dumb tests. And about the arts needing a theory, I don't think that art education should just be do anything you want. I mean, certainly students were learning all kinds of skills and techniques in the classes that we were studying. But at the same time as they were learning these techniques, they were developing these habits of mind. So I hope I've answered your question a little. Okay.
¿Podemos bajar el micro aquí abajo? Tenemos una... Va a ser la última pregunta que vamos a hacer, ¿vale? El resto ya sabéis que, pues si tenéis alguna duda más, luego a través de la web se puede resolver. Que eso detecta el castellano. Si hablas en inglés no te lo coge.
Tienes que haber empezado por hola.
Claro. Di hola, di hola.
Uy,
Que lo estás diciendo sin H. Dilo con Ale.
I can hear you, but I don't think anybody else can. I can repeat the question.
I want to know if you are, I don't know if it's, I'm correct or not, but I understand that you say that the study of the arts or the connection, the arts,
Yeah.
and study the other materials or math or
Yeah.
materials, that if you study arts, that increase your potential in the other areas. And do you think it is some place that the creative is inside, it is in the brain, and they don't discover where it is? Why there are people that are more creative than others? Why people can, develop or have intuition in some things? And you never make a study with the neuroscientifics?
Yeah, okay. So what she has asked me is, first of all, it seems that my research is showing that if you study the arts, it improves your potential in other areas. And I want to qualify that. I'm asking that question. I don't think we've shown that yet. With one study, we showed it with spatial reasoning, the geometry study. We need many more studies of each of the habits of mind before I can say for sure that studying the arts makes you better in other areas. But that shouldn't affect whether we study the arts, because they should be justified for their own sake. The second question you asked is, are there individual differences in creativity, and have I done any neuroscientific studies of creativity? Now, I think that to ask the question, are there individual differences in creativity, is a little bit complicated, and Walter Thompson and I have been arguing about this because he thinks there aren't and I think there are. But if you talk about major creativity, like Picasso or Mozart, people who really invent something huge, I think those people are geniuses. And we don't know if their brains are different because we haven't looked at their brains. But if I had to guess, I would say somehow they're either starting out differently or they develop differently as a function of environmental stimulation. I don't think we need to study the brain in order to figure out what to do about education. I really don't. I did one study of neuroscience and music. I worked with a neuroscientist, and we asked the question, do young children who start to play a musical instrument, do their brains change? And because we know that adult musicians have 5 different areas of their brains that are larger than non-musicians. So the question is, were they born that way? Or is this a result of all of the work they're doing musically? So we took children who had never studied a musical instrument, and some of them were about to start, and some of them were not about to start. And we followed them for 2 years, and we scanned their brains using functional magnetic resonance imaging and structural MRI. And we found that in the beginning, the 2 groups were identical. There were no brain differences. And that at the end of 2 years, the ones who had studied music had grown larger in 2 areas that will not surprise you at all. One is the auditory cortex, the area of the brain that responds to sound. And the other is the motor cortex, the area of the brain that controls motor movement, because the musical instruments require motor movement. So people said to me, oh, this is great. Now you've shown why we need to teach music. And I said, no, I haven't shown that at all. Because there's also a study showing that if you teach adults how to juggle, after 3 months, their brains grow larger in the visual spatial area. Does this mean we should teach juggling in school? It maybe or maybe not, but it's not because of the brain, it's because of your values about what you think is important to teach.
Yes, but that doesn't happen when the children, for instance, if you learn the mathematics when they are very, very young and can form more than others, but that doesn't happen as well as happen with music, because music involves all those areas and move all those parts of the brain.
But mathematics involves many areas of the brain too.
Yes, but you say that music is better. The children are more, a baby, very, very small, 2-3 months, a baby or inside the mother can't understand the music, can
hear the music.
Hear and
respond to it.
Respond to it. And doesn't happen when the mother speaks, for example.
Actually, there are some new studies showing that babies, right after birth, first of all, they respond differently to their mother's voice than to other people's voices because they've heard it. But second of all, they respond differently to the language that their mother has spoken while they were in the womb. So they already can hear the language, the sounds of the language.
But the benefits is the same, or is better when the baby can hear the music?
So the
results are better?
Are you asking, is it beneficial for babies to hear music before they're born?
Yeah.
I would say beneficial in what way? It probably makes them respond to music more when they're born, and that's great. And playing music to kids is wonderful because it makes them hear more and more music and their brains respond to the music. But there's no evidence that makes them better at language, no evidence that makes them better at math, and that doesn't matter because music is just as important as language and math. But people want to believe that there's evidence that it makes you better, but there's no good study out there that shows that. Would be nice, but there isn't. But we don't need that in order to teach music in our schools. We just need to have the value that music is important, because music is an important human invention people spend more time listening to music than just about anything else during their day. I don't know, I hope I answered that question okay.
Yes, of course.